You've scanned the headlines, read the articles, and liked the posts. Now listen to the experts themselves in the Future of Work podcast, presented by allwork.space. Today we welcome Pauline Roussel, co-author of Around the World in 250 Coworking Spaces. After running a coworking space in Berlin for 3 years, she traveled the world of collaborative workspaces together with Dimitar Inchev to understand their uniqueness, importance, and impact on people and cities. They have visited over 450 of them across 50 cities, from Tokyo to New York. Their mission, make coworking better.
Okay, well, thank you, Pauline, for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to having you on the Future of Work podcast. We're really happy to have you here, and thank you for joining us from Berlin.
Thanks for having me. I'm also very looking forward to our conversation today.
Fantastic. And I know you're in Berlin at the moment, but you don't stay in the same spot for very long. And I'm referring to your co-working book, which is a fantastic book called Around the World in 250 Co-working Spaces. And to research this book, you visited over 500 co-working spaces across 50 cities, which is quite incredible. And I'm looking forward to digging into that. But before we go into all the research that you took for your book and the places that you visited, can you talk to us a little bit about co-working, where it came from, what it is, and how it works?
Sure. Thanks again for having me. I'm really happy to be on the podcast today. It's actually a really interesting question that we are often asked, or that we often use to ask when we conduct workshops, like who knows when co-working started? And I think a lot of the people have this conception through the big brands that it started around 2010, but actually there were a lot of movements already in the 90s, actually in Berlin and in other regions around Europe, that were not called co-working per se yet, or they were not branded co-working. They were called shared spaces, collaborative workspaces. I'm thinking about C-Base, for instance, in Berlin, which was more of like a hacker space. And then there was another initiative in Vienna that started back in 2003. But the official start of the co-working as a movement was in 2005 in San Francisco. And the person who actually coined the term co-working as a place to work was Brad Neuberg. And I think co-working is also, if we look at it, it's a trend that's fostered by global innovation developments. Specifically, I would say in the IT sector. For one, is the innovation in technology that allows people to work from laptops and good Wi-Fi internet from places that are not their offices. And then the second innovation, if we can call it that, is the changing habits of the new generation that grows up with flexibility and mobility in everything they do. Specifically in our case, when we look at the trend of remote work, for instance, combined with the enormous uptick in startups and small companies in the last decade, co-working really came as a natural solution, as an affordable and flexible workplace. So that's when it started. People were able to share a place to work from. But the next surge, I think, of co-working's popularity came with larger brands investing heavily in marketing. And I think that started more around 2010. So 5 years after the initial start of the movement. And that really attracted more members and inspiring entrepreneurs to create their own co-working spaces. So this influx of users and brands has really diversified and professionalized for the industry, drawing also individuals who appreciate both the business and social benefits of co-working.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. And you said that it comes a lot from hacker spaces originally. And can you explain that term and what that means?
So when we talk about hacker spaces, it was people, again, very linked to the IT industry and the tech world. So it was people who were kind of coming into a room to work on side projects that were mainly tech related. So that was what was called hacker spaces.
And that technology that is still so important today, wherever you work, whether you're online, offline, everybody needs that technology.
Yeah. And I just want to say, sorry.
That's okay.
I just want to say, if people are interested in C-Base, the space I was referring in the beginning of the podcast, it still exists to this day in Berlin. They have a website that is still on and where they share the whole story and the genesis of why they started it. And I think it's really interesting to look at. So if you look at C-Base in Berlin, you'll have the full picture of what it is and what they stand for.
Excellent. We'll include that in the bio and the transcript at the end. Thank you for that. And you said that co-working came from a need of flexibility and mobility, and that's more true today, especially after the pandemic, than perhaps ever before. So I'm interested, how has co-working changed in recent years, and in particular, what impact did the pandemic have on co-working as we know it today?
I think initially in 2020, when the pandemic happened and everybody was wondering, what the future would look like, co-working seemed to be really threatened by the pandemic and COVID and everything. But I think eventually, looking at it now, it really propelled the industry forward. The shift away from traditional office commuting led more people to seek co-working spaces closer to home, aiding also the industry's growth overall, I would say. So it's actually a very interesting question. People always ask us, where is it going? And I always wish I could predict, the future to answer fully to that question. I can't yet predict the future, but what I can see and what we can see now, looking on the daily at like industry movements, are a few different things, I think. Today, we see, for instance, co-working becoming more and more an amenity to many other concepts. We hear more and more about co-working being used to activate a building. I think this activation component is becoming very important. And that can happen in residential or even commercial buildings. That also means that we see more and more commercial real estate brands or larger real estate companies looking into co-working. And they do that in few ways from what we see today in terms of like movements. Either they start their own co-working brands from scratch, or they would acquire existing ones. To add also on what I was saying maybe earlier, we also now see co-working operators developing more and more offers for larger companies where they develop, run, and activate a space for them. So the company basically just comes in and the operator takes care of the rest. That's what is called operated offices / serviced office, I think. Some of the interesting things we also see today, and I think it's going to develop even more in the future, is the development of co-working spaces outside of the large cities. I think prior to the pandemic, everything was happening a lot in London, New York, or Paris. And I think the second to third tier cities were not catching up. But I think that's also something the pandemic really shifted. We see that more and more co-working spaces in smaller towns are opening, and obviously also in rural areas, which is really interesting. I think rural co-working, that being said, still has a lot of challenges ahead, particularly on developing a sustainable business model. But we already have plenty of examples, and including in our book, of the positive impact of co-working spaces in less populated areas around the world.
And really, because co-working can adapt and become so many different things depending on the needs of its specific community, the people in that area, it can really sort of, I want to say infiltrate, but it can really appear anywhere, can't it? It can pop up, like you say, in the suburbs, in the rural areas, in town and city centres. It can really be where it needs to be.
Actually, while traveling, you said earlier that we visited 500 co-working spaces. We came up with a quote, which I think really illustrates what you just said. And it's co-working is the same dish, everyone cooks differently. Right. So actually, there are like so many recipes. Co-working is that dish that some people will add more salt, more chili sauce, or more, pepper. But it's still co-working. And I think that really illustrates what you're saying. Like it can literally, the model can exist in many forms and in many places.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great quote. And I'm glad you brought up your book, because I really want to hear about the research that you did. It sounds absolutely fascinating. So you visited over 500 co-working spaces across 50 cities. So can you help us to imagine what that was like, what that experience was like?
So maybe to give the listeners a little bit of background on all of that, it all started because Dimitar, so my partner, and I met in a co-working space I used to be the chief happiness officer of in Berlin. which means general manager, basically. And Dimitar was a member. So he was working for a startup accelerator at the time. And he was entrepreneur in residence in that accelerator. Our co-working space was a little bit special in the sense that it was only accessible to early stage startup founders. And at the time in Berlin, 2015, as I said, there were plenty of other spaces that were targeting very different audiences, like freelancers, musicians, or even parents. And when we looked at the scene in the city itself, we really started to wonder what was the daily life looking like in other spaces around us, but also how other operators were creating value for their communities. I think we were looking for those answers also for us on how can we improve and what can we learn from having those conversations with other people who do the same as us. Because although the scene was diverse, I think in Berlin back in 2015, co-working was not as popular as it is today, for instance. So we thought that being able to have those conversations were really important. And so to find out for ourselves, that's how the research actually started. So we went out in the city and we interviewed, I think, around 20 plus co-working founders and teams, always with those two questions. What's the daily life like in your space? And also, how do you create value for your members? And one day we presented on a Friday a community breakfast in our co-working space, which was open to anyone in the city and beyond. We presented the outcome of our research. So what did we learn and what did we figure out by talking to all those people? And that day was actually kind of interesting. We had a special guest in the audience, which was the founder of Talent Garden. So if people do not know Talent Garden, it's one of Italy's largest co-working brand. And so after presenting what we've learned, Davide, the founder, he came to us and said, oh, you guys should come to Milan. We have a very different kind of way of doing co-working because we have an educational component plugged to the concept. We actually have a school inside. And we took his words and we just said, okay, let's go to Milan. But instead of visiting just his co-working space, we took the time to explore the city and we visited other concepts like a coffees, so co-working / cafe / office, but also other smaller, more independent co-working spaces. And when we came back to Berlin, we saw how different Milan was from the city where we were based. And it really sparked our appetite for more. And I think from then on, we just kept on traveling, always with those two questions in mind and always eager to learn what people are doing, why they are doing it, how they are doing it. Yeah. Now to maybe should I add on how that comes into a book, or do you want to?
Yeah, I think it would be good to know. What I could ask you now is any interesting co-working concepts. So during your research, what were the most sort of interesting concepts you came across of all these different co-working spaces you saw and how they fit into their local culture?
That's also a very good question because I think we realized very early on how different one co-working space was from the other. And that's mainly also driven by the team that creates and run the co-working space. So in the book, we have 250 stories of co-working teams and concepts that are existing around the world. But I think if we go into the niche or into the things that you might not expect in terms of concepts, we have, for instance, co-working kitchens. So people who actually, they do not, work on laptops, but rather they cook there. So it's like catering businesses, food startups. And what's really interesting about those is that usually the co-working space provides the latest technology in terms of material, which, for instance, in the cooking industry is quite expensive. There are a few stories in the book from Vienna or from Berlin, where they did partnerships with larger companies to equip the space. And then the members, they have that chance to, come in and use the latest technologies to develop products or to cook for their catering businesses. I think we even have a story in the co-working space in Berlin that's for chefs, where one of the startups developed a vegan tuna and from that co-working space, and they won a lot of prizes for it. And now it's distributed in a lot of supermarket chains across Germany. So that's one example. Another one I would really love to give, just because it's usually people are really reacting when I give it. is a co-working space for the elderly people. So
wow.
the criteria to judge, you see?
Yeah.
The criteria to judge is that is that you need to be 60 years old plus. And that's really fascinating. It's actually a brand from the US. And the reason why Thomas, the founder, started it is because he understood that the moment you retire, you become irrelevant for the working society. But he saw a lot of potential for the elderly to remain active and connected if only they would understand the technology we currently live in. So he created a free co-working space. So members who join, they do not have anything to pay. And they get every day when they go to the space, they have the chance to, learn about what's an iPhone, how do you start an iPhone, all those things that might sound so easy for us, but not for them. He has a lot of really interesting stories. They also learn how to develop websites, how to develop their Etsy shops, because a lot of the elderly women, for instance, they knit. So they would create their product and then they would put it on Etsy, But before joining the co-working space, they didn't know about Etsy. So that's, for instance, also a story I find really interesting and quite different from what we are used to see when we think about co-working on the daily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking, some people think, like you said at the start of our conversation, a lot of people think of co-working as being a shared office and that's it, desk, chair, a few people around you and that's it. But it's sort of become so much more, and it's become a term that's used to, like you say, it's not just sitting at a desk anymore. It's bringing people together to learn new skills. And I'm curious, you mentioned before that there were some kitchen spaces. What other types of sort of hands-on spaces have you seen? Like, for example, have there been manufacturing spaces, industrial type spaces where people can go in and utilize the space and the machinery?
Yes, actually there is. There are plenty of different examples. So there are manufacturing spaces. There is one I'm thinking about, for instance, in Vienna. It was actually started by a larger corporate company who understood that to stay relevant to the time we are living in, they needed to innovate, and they found in co-working solution to how can we innovate with the space we have. So what was really interesting, because they do hard tech, so anything related to building hardware. And their realization when they started to get close to the startup industry and the startup world was that when a startup based in Europe want to manufacture small components, under 20,000 pieces, they have most of the time to go very far away. So like China or other countries. And they thought, but wait, here we could manufacture that, and that would save them tremendous time and tremendous resources. Yeah. And so that's how they started the co-working space. And actually, it's quite cool when you go there. It's called Factory Hub for people who are curious. And you walk around, it's literally an assembly line where you can see components being printed, being manufactured. But it is a co-working space because all those things that you see, they're shared. People can actually, it's just like everything is shared.
That's amazing.
And one of a trend, also those like profession-focused co-working spaces are really popping up. For instance, now, this year in particular, we don't have some in the book, but if we write a second one or something like that, that would be in it, I guess. It's more like working for doctors or for people from the health industry. I saw co-working spaces in France for dentists that we came across. In Germany, there is like a chain of co-working for doctors that came out. So that's also interesting to see how they are, transforming the model and making it work for them.
That's fantastic. And I have a really difficult question for you now. Do you have a personal favorite? Yeah, out of 500 spaces, what's your favorite?
It's always a very difficult question. Even if I think about it for myself, I still struggle to find and say, oh yeah, this one was definitely my favorite. Yeah. And usually I'm really honest when I'm saying that it's very hard for me to say if there was only one, that would be it. Because I also think that having a favorite is a little bit of a subjective type of feeling, or it's a subjective answer, because my personal favorite, if I had one, would probably be different than yours. The same as like when you recommend a hotel or a restaurant, you have to understand what do you look for in that place to kind of like say, I really enjoyed it. So for instance, for me, when I try to help people find co-working spaces that they would really like, because I think, there's also this analogy of like looking for a co-working space sometimes feel very overwhelming. There are too many options when you are in big cities, and it's really difficult for you to say, how do I find one that I would actually like? And so my advice in general is like, I always tell people, first ask yourself, what's your primary reason for wanting to join a co-working space? Do you want to join because you want to work away from home? Do you want to join because you want to connect with people, or maybe you want to have just meetings there in a better setup than home? Or like real people, I recommend them to list what they want. And then I recommend them to do some research on Google. What kind of co-working spaces are around you? How do you feel when you go on their websites? What their social media communication look like? What, kind of like excites you? Because I remember, for instance, the co-working space I used to run. The first time I came in for the job interview, I had like little goosebumps. It was like, wow, what a cool place. I felt so excited. I was like, it was an extra motivation for me to get the job. I was like, I really want that job because the space looks fantastic. So I tell people, like, when you enter a co-working space, is that the feeling you get? Or are you like, I'm not sure? Because I think that's also important, like to educate people in finding the right place for them so that they want to return. Because otherwise, we've met a lot of people who had, I would say, experiences that didn't meet their expectations. And so now when we meet them and we do workshops and they talk to us, they're like, for me, co-working doesn't work. And when you dig deeper, you're like, but why? And they only tried one, and they had a so-so experience because, again, the questions or the options they had were not really for them. So my last advice on that, to find your personal favorite, is also to not just try one. Give yourself the time to try a few brands. Very often, co-working spaces, they offer, they have day passes. So book a day pass, try different options around you, if you have options, obviously, and just try to compare and see what works for you. And I think that's like really interesting for people to make their own decisions and find their favorites.
Yeah. No, I love how you didn't answer the question, but you did answer the question. And when we spoke before, we talked about how one of the things you wanted to do with the book was to make co-working better. So I'm curious, with your experience both of running a space and of visiting so many spaces and spending time in so many different spaces, what do you feel is missing from co-working, and how can it become better so that it becomes a really solid part of the future of work?
It's a great question. And I really want to add into what you just asked me, in the sense that our mission is really, as you said, to make co-working better. And the book that we self-published is just one of the ways we work to make that happen. And when we say make co-working better, it's not necessarily about what is missing, but more so how can the knowledge that we have accumulated and our work experience support the constant growth of the industry. So the book is a bridge, I would say, that connects co-working to the world and vice versa. What we see from people who purchase the copy and from teams who use it is that it really educates readers on the diversity and flexible nature of co-working and all of its benefits, while also simultaneously showcasing the growth and diversity of the co-working community to the world. So to sum it up today, a lot of our work, when we say we want to make co-working better, revolves around educating about co-working, with focus on people that do not know about it that much. So we do a lot of work around educating organizations and institutions. So we have a special focus on education for the younger generation. We work a lot with high schools and universities, so that they can understand what's co-working, and then when they enter the job market, they can actually look for one. Then we also educate a lot traditional brands and companies on what is co-working, but also how they can utilize it for their people. And of course, we help a lot co-working spaces. Having seen so many brands around the world, we really help operators also build better teams and align with their overall mission and vision. And we do a lot of public knowledge sharing activities, online events, etc., just so that everybody can learn from each other. So to sum up my thoughts around making co-working better, I think concentrating on education for the public at large, we really try to engage with larger audiences who may not deeply be familiar with co-working yet. And so that's one of the meanings for us behind our mission to make co-working better and creating more understanding between co-working and the public. So the book is a vehicle, I would say, for us.
To build those bridges. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
And just following on from that, we are nearing the end of our conversation, but I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into how co-working spaces, the impact they can have on people in cities, on specific areas. And I know you've covered this quite a lot in your book. So can you talk a little bit about how co-working spaces can help support local entrepreneurs, local businesses, and local business communities?
Sure. For anybody that listens to the podcast now, I would like for you to imagine two images. The first one would be a Google map where when you type co-working, nothing pops up. There's no red dots anywhere on that Google map. And then the second image is like when you type co-working, you suddenly have a lot of co-working spaces that pops up around you. Now, when you picture those two, imagine the difference in terms of impact for people who are from smaller teams, from smaller companies, when they can finally or have access to a place where not only will they be able to do their work, but also be able to collaborate with others, learn from others, and most importantly, also access opportunities that they might not have access if there were no co-working spaces like events or workshops or training. I think when we talk about the impact of co-working for local entrepreneurs and businesses, what it really facilitates is that it's like the connections on different levels in a city. So from providing a place to work and a network to a shared place for sharing ideas, knowledge also, obviously, and skills. And I would even say that we can argue that co-working spaces are becoming the most important social spaces for work globally, actually.
Fantastic. It's so easy to see how it's becoming such an important part of the future of work, and it's been building, not slowly, but it's been building steadily and in recent years more rapidly ever since that first co-working space back in 2005. So it's really fascinating to see how co-working is evolving and shaping depending on local needs. And just one last thing I wanted to ask you. We often, when people think or ask about co-working, co-living tends to pop up in the conversation as well. Was this anything that you researched during your journey?
We didn't research it as extensively as co-working, obviously, because otherwise I think, and I also think that when we started traveling, which was back in 2015, co-living was still, blossoming compared to co-working that was already existing for quite some time. That being said, we did visit a few co-living spaces. There are actually even some in the book. I think we have like 2 or 3 brands that are doing co-living. But I would say it's also a very different animal per se, because, the way we work together versus the way we live. I think building a co-working space versus building a co-living space is very different in terms of bringing people together. Just because in a work context versus a home context, people act very differently and expect very different things. But we are very interested about co-living as well, and we follow the trend and the co-living communities that exist around the world, because we see it becoming also a very big trend all over the world, and not just, again, in big cities, but also in smaller cities and towns.
Yeah, fascinating. So that's another one to watch.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for Pauline for coming on and talking to us today. Your knowledge is just wonderful, and your enthusiasm, it's fantastic. So thank you so much for coming on and talking to us all about co-working and about co-living as well. So can you tell us where we can find a copy of your book and how people can contact you if they want to learn more about all things co-working?
Yes, so the book which I have here can be found on our website, which is coworkiesbook.com. I'm sure we'll put the link in the summary of this episode. And to connect with me or with Dimitar, don't hesitate to come on LinkedIn. We are quite active there. We also have an Instagram account at Coworkies where we are quite active. So that usually the channels where you'll find us.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And I look forward to having another catch up in a year or so and seeing how different things are then.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
If it's impacting the future of work, it's in the Future of Work podcast by allwork.space.